here we are again with another video looking at a very important aspect of campaigning. GOTV, it's shortened to Get Out the Vote. Justin Tomlinson from Conservative Print, former Member of Parliament, is here. Done more Get Out the Vote campaigns than most people I know. It's important though, isn't it?
Yeah, I have to say, I also enjoy them. They're very exciting, particularly if you end up winning. They're incredibly important, and there are two parts to a GOTV operation. Obviously, postal voting earlier in the campaign, and I'm sure we'll cover that in our interview later on, but the election day. And there are different ways of doing it, where you've got lots of helpers, the traditional way, have a committee room, somebody in charge, somebody entering in data into the computer, people sat at polling stations to identify who has voted, to then shorten the list of the doors that need to be knocked up, and having loads of teams going out knocking on doors. Now, I can remember being involved in many of those, but increasingly, as all political parties find it harder to find volunteers, there are different ways to do it. So, for example, in Swindon, we will pick 2 or 3 wards to target, and we will do a dawn raid. We will have breakfast together. We will then split into teams to knock on doors. We will have lunch together, rebalance the teams, and we go again, early afternoon tea, and then go and get the post-work thing, and you just go all day, and then in the final hours do telling at polling stations to show a presence. But also, I have customers who say to me, I'm on my own, or there's a couple of us. And I always say, just do something, even if it's delivering a leaflet throughout the daytime, even if you can't do the whole ward, pick your best areas, or sit on the polling station, because people are voting on the election day, so at least do something, and that in itself might get you those 1 or 2 votes that might make the difference.
Yeah, and I can remember fighting some elections as well, where there's very few people to actually help and be boots on the ground. But the point is, anything is better than nothing.
Yeah, and that's where, again, you know, if it's a council by-election, you're obviously all into one. If it's a whole set of local elections, do you leave everybody in their ward, or do you try and sort of bring people together? Increasingly, we often see that everybody does something in their own ward with an early morning delivery, and then teams come together to go into those marginal wards. And it depends on where you are on the council. With Swindon Borough Council, we had many, many years where the majority was between 1 or 3 or 5. And so when you had the local elections or council by-elections, it going one way or the other would have changed the nature of the council. So, you know, you have to think very carefully. And I have been involved in many, many election days where we've won by a handful of votes. We've known it was because of what we did on the day.
Yeah, it's really important, isn't it? Well, I don't know if there's a collective noun for former MPs, but we've got 2, let's add a third, and speak to someone who knows very well about running an effective Get Out the Vote campaign. Well, let's talk a bit about the importance of a Get Out the Vote campaign and doing it properly from someone who knows only too well. He and I entered Parliament together in 2015 on the same day, funnily enough. Nearly neighbouring constituencies. Torbay, former Member of Parliament, Kevin Foster. Kevin, welcome.
Hi, Peter. How are you? Yeah, well, at least we may not have directly neighboured each other, but at least we're from the county that knew how to do a scone right.
The county that matters, you're absolutely right. Now, Kevin, Get Out the Vote. It is incredibly important, but sometimes people don't quite get why that is. How would you sum up how important it is and why?
I think what we've got to remember is the vast majority of people do not live their life based on local government, and particularly local government by-election scheduling. So most people will not be sat at home thinking, God, must make a diary date to vote in the Swindon elections next year. God, that's the biggest moment happening next May. In fact, the fact that we're laughing when we say it is because we instantly know, people down the pub tonight are not going to be talking about next May's local elections. So that's why we've got to remember we might be focused on it. We might know how long it is to go. Most voters don't. And it's those people we need to remind, particularly Conservative supporters, for whatever reason, are thinking about perhaps not voting or not very inspired, but reminding them that every week and every year there are council seats in particular, and sometimes general election seats, decided by less than 10 votes.
Okay, so you've got experience of that, because I think, if you don't mind me saying so, your wife, didn't she win a very, very tight election?
She did. In June, just before the general election in 2024, Hazel won by 9 votes. We had about a 40% turnout for a closely thought by-election. You know, had we stayed in bed that morning, we know what would have happened next.
All right, now let's talk about the practicalities of doing a get out the vote operation. And before you even get to actual polling day, when people go and stick their ballot paper in a box, you've got postal votes, which are incredibly important. You've got to do a get out the vote campaign for the postal votes, haven't you?
Yeah, too often people are forgetting that actually for many people the election day is 2 weeks, even slightly longer, before actual so-called polling day. You know, once people have filled their postal votes in, that's it. And in particular in some by-elections where we're finding perhaps there isn't a reform candidate or where perhaps there's a particular, you know, popular independent has stood down, you've got votes going. You know, people aren't sure how they're going to vote. And the sooner we can get round, talk to them, encourage them to fill in, particularly those who perhaps have got a postal vote for a general election primarily, but have had this paperwork come for a council, they don't really know what's going on about. Speaking to them can make a real difference. In Hazel's by-election, we literally just knocked the door of postal voters. We knew not to be against us, if I can put it that way. And we actually got extra votes just from doing that.
Now, I'm guessing that get out the vote, you do it differently depending on whether it's the postal vote or whether it's actually polling day itself. You're knocking on doors for both of those, are you?
Yeah, I think it's a different style for postal voters because you've probably got a couple of days to do it over. And again, depending on your resources, you might want to start a few days before the actual vote goes out. So, for example, you're starting to canvass people. Of course, the numbers should get slightly less because you will identify, even in the most supportive area for us, a couple of people who are not going to be thinking of voting Conservative. And then you can work on that in the run-up. But whereas for on the day, you've probably got the night before. So again, thinking of your resources, which are the areas best done the night before? So a big rural area with perhaps a town in the middle of it, do the farms the day before, do the urban centre on the day. And also, it's not just knocking doors, it's also getting stuff through the door. So, for example, a dawn raid can be really important in a local by-election, that reminder, particularly to our supporters who may be going to work to vote for. But clearly no one's going to thank you for knocking on their door at about 5:45 in the morning to ask them if they're planning to vote that day. That has to be a delivery.
I just think there's 2 really important points there that Kevin's raised. First of all, recognising your own resources. None of us have as many helpers as we'd ideally like, and so the fact that Kevin rightly starts early, so it's not just the election day, knocking up those rural areas, the more fiddly, the areas where you've perhaps got less data, so there's a bit more walking per door, do those perhaps before election day, and then concentrate your efforts on the sort of main areas on election day itself. And that second thing about starting early, now I'd be interested, Kevin, when I was a bit younger, we didn't bat an eyelid at starting at the very early hours. But we've started pushing that back perhaps now to 6:30, partly because of Ring doorbells, and we're worried that even just delivering too early, sets something off and wakes somebody up, which is a really good way not to get a vote on election day. So how do you balance that?
I think some of it is you need to think of the area you're in. So, for example, parts of Torbay are blocks of flats where there's perhaps large letterboxes together, predominantly aimed at those aged over 55, 60. So there's less Ring doorbells. But you need to judge it and ultimately use your own common sense. And if it's an area with lots of Ring doorbells, as you say, people getting a buzz on their phone may not be too popular, although a lot of people will pay attention, have switched off those sorts of functions in the early hours of the morning, that the record may still be there. But it is about a balance. And again, it's really thinking about your resources, what's best for your campaign. And also, of course, with the increase in postal voters in recent years, there's perhaps slightly less people to be knocked up on the day. Certainly the number of lifts we used to do as a result of door knocking has gone down, as predominantly those who might struggle to get out and about now have a postal vote, rather than trying to get someone to give them a lift down the polling station.
So once you finish that early dawn raid, what time would you start knocking up?
Well, assuming you've got tellers on the polling station, something else that people need to perhaps try and remember. Good thing for a candidate to do for the morning when people are starting to come out and about. Usually about lunchtime-ish, allow your dawn raid team to have a bit of a break. I think there's nothing more selfish than sometimes you see people who Others have been out on a dawn raid, and there's no attempt to try and relieve them. Let them just go in and have an hour or two sleep. Because, so they can do the rest of the day. Usually about lunchtime start phoning through, leaving voicemail messages, particularly for people who are at work, and then probably your actual physical knocking up mid-afternoonish. But again, people need to judge their own area. And also the time of year. This time of year, you probably need to start about lunchtime because it'll be dark by about 5 o'clock-ish. Whereas in the midsummer, June, you can keep knocking doors well until about 8:30.
Now, when I started doing elections, you had the fabled committee room, and you had a whole team of people, and in the days often before computers, you had your voting intentions on spreadsheets, on large bits of paper. That's where canvassing used to be on canvas, didn't it? Yeah. Do you need all of that now, or can you run a perfectly good get-out-the-vote operation from an iPhone?
If you've got the resources, it's great to have the old style of committee room. Particularly, it's a great job for someone who perhaps that knows what they're doing, but now physically would struggle to get out and about. I can think of one or two activists we've got in their 70s and 80s for whom being out doing a dawn raid, that's not really for them anymore. But they can sit, they can organise. But yes, you can do it from a phone if you've got a good tech-enabled team. And again, this is where think of what your own resources are. You can do effectively from a phone, from a pad, sending people out with, all using the sort of Canvasser app. But again, judge it by your own team. If people aren't comfortable with the app, there's nothing wrong in having perhaps someone who wouldn't be able to get out and about and knock doors, sat at your house with printed sheets, crossing people off.
And I think Kevin's absolutely right there. You've got to, again, judge your resources. Yeah. So we used to run traditional committee rooms. And that would be a good place because the advantage of that is you can advertise people and say, look, when you're available to come and help us, either past work or after you've done the school run, come to this location, there's packs ready for you to go. As numbers have become tighter, particularly if we're targeting multiple wards on election day, we've switched to having a set meeting point. So we would do the dawn raid, we'd then all rendezvous for breakfast, normally McDonald's, split into teams, go and do the morning phase, then meet for lunch, normally Wetherspoons, and then have lunch, split, rebalance the teams out as people come and go, and then go again, then have something at about 4 o'clock. So you've eaten and rested before then the final push, which is when people are coming back from work.
Yeah.
So it's about judging it. But then I've also helped provide stuff for people where you're on your own. You are literally the only person in your ward in a day. And so then you have to balance, am I better just doing an extra leaflet all day? Or are there certain areas where I can have a good door knocking session that might get me those handful of votes over? And as we saw with Hazel winning by 9 votes and a number of the other people we've talked to in our other training videos, so many elections are won or lost by that one little bit of extra activity. Yeah. And Kevin has demonstrated that very well.
And actually what's come through here, and as Justin says in some of the other videos we've done as well, is there is not a one-size-fits-all rule that goes on here. You cut your cloth depending on what your resources are, depending on what sort of ward or constituency you're in. People, I think, are scared that there's set rules that they have to follow, and there really aren't, are they?
No, the only rules you have to be conscious of are the election rules, the law. So, for example, party political campaigners can no longer pick up postal votes to take to the polling station in the way you could 20 years ago, which some of us may remember that time of GOTV. But no, generally, it's not one size fits all. It's think of who's your team, what's your resources, what's your ward. So a GOTV campaign for a group of university students in a larger city, suburban area we're targeting, lots of new estates, is going to look very different to a campaign in the middle of rural Devon, where we've perhaps got more experienced campaigners, but who aren't quite so comfortable with tech.
We also always traditionally, to support hospitality, normally have a campaign team pub meal the night before on the Wednesday evening. Mm. And that allows us to explain, particularly to the new people, how it's going to work. For many people to give them their dawn raid leaflets. So rather than everybody having to come to one set location, the core team probably will do, but others will say, I'm going to do mine on the way to work. So they'll take their pack away that night and then they will do it en route. And we find that's always very, very helpful because every single set of elections, you've got a cohort of new campaigners, and this is all sort of, they don't really understand the frenetic nature of an election day. So it's a good way for us to work out everything then. And generally, people who've come to that will always turn up then on the day, because you need every last person you can get your hands on.
And just a word about targeting, Kevin. Let's say it's the afternoon of polling day. You're going into the evening. Assuming you've got the resources and the boots on the ground to do it, which areas do you target? Do you target the roads where you've got a couple of guaranteed Conservative voters who you know haven't been to the polling station yet? Or do you take a bit of a gamble and go to perhaps a less good road where there's a possibility you'll get more people out?
I think on election day you need to target, and it is individual targeting. You know, that you do want to be talking to people, and this could come into perhaps a separate sort of discussions around when you should be canvassing, how you should be identifying potential supporters. But getting out, knocking doors and talking to individuals who canvass. So, but again, look at the resource you've got. If you've got lots of young, fit people ready to run up and down a set of steps in a particular part of Torquay, fantastic. If not, be realistic about what you can do. And also, sometimes you can think about, for example, if someone always votes, and is there how much time you rush round to talk to them again on particular election day, if they're a solid supporter of ours, versus, shall we say, calling on that person who's Conservative or a P, or perhaps a little bit unsure nationally, or votes every general election but sporadically for locals. Those are the people you really need to get to if you've got a limited resource.
The other thing, Kevin was right to talk about the geographical areas. So your rural, more walking, try and do that potentially before election day. But the other thing to consider is the demographics of the people. So if you've got parts of a ward where it's predominantly older voters, they tend to vote early. So those might be the areas you target. And then you've got your sort of new build areas where predominantly they will be out at work. So they would probably be your key ones for once you get the sort of post 5 o'clock as people are coming back. So those are other factors to then consider.
Well, yeah. It is incredibly important, and as you said, Kevin, Hazel won, I think, by 9 votes, you said. So that's a couple of houses knocked on, which made the difference there, isn't it? So vitally important to do.
I've seen people win by 1, and there've always been examples. We can all think of examples where people have ended up drawing a pencil or things like that. But it's really important, and we have to remember our opponents are doing this. You know, if we think that if we decide to stay in bed or whatever, that no one else is going to be out and about, think again. Particularly when we're up against the Liberal Democrats, they will be out, certainly on by-election days, doing dawn raids. So that the fact that we've decided not to doesn't mean other people will take the same view.
And that's right. And whilst in an ideal world you've got a full GOT operation, if you are literally last man standing, whether that is you sat on a polling station all day with your rosette and being recognised, and the number of times I've seen people say, well, do you know what, you're the only one who's bothered, or spending the day delivering a leaflet. So whilst in your ideal world, you've got your knocking up teams, you're doing everything, if you just simply can't do that, don't do nothing, do something. It can be that little bit that gets you over the line.
Absolutely. And just a final word, you touched on this yourself, Kevin, and you, Justin, as well. What happens on polling day, what happens at a polling station, there's probably more rules around that when it comes to actual election law than any other bit of the campaign. We haven't got time to go through all of those now, but you as a candidate or your agent need to be very well versed in what election law says about where you're allowed to be at a polling station, what you're allowed to say, and that's really important. As I say, that's something to read up on separately.
But, I mean, to be fair, if you go to a polling station with a rosette on, the elections team will normally say to you, this is an area we're happy for you to sit in. And I've been doing this sort of well over 25 years, and they're very good.
Yeah.
And different polling stations have slightly different interpretations of the rules, and they will soon tell you if they think you're not doing the right thing. And you just accept that, because that are the rules of the day.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much indeed. Your household, the living embodiment of the truth that get out the vote makes a real difference. Thank you very much indeed for spending time with us.